Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream on this July 4th. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. As the U.S. is celebrating its formation as a state, it is in a state of endless war, and no clearer is this reality than in West Asia, where a U.S.-backed Israeli attack on Iran brought the region and Israel itself to the brink of disaster. Now Iran is warning Israel that its next attack could be the final one for the Zionist regime, even as Israeli military officials claim this is just phase one of a larger regime change operation. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues, but so too does the resistance. Hezbollah is resisting disarmament, and the U.S. is signaling that the pretext of a nuclear Iran will continue to fuel more war. Where is all of this headed? To discuss, I have with me three very special guests. First, returning guest, Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger and host of State of Play on Mint Press News YouTube channel. Greg, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And then we have first-time guests. It's been probably that is a big mistake of mine. We have Mnar Adley, founder of Mint Press News. She has been generous enough to publish my work in the past. Incredible commentator and writer. Mnar, good to see you.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And then we have Elina Xenophontos. She's a geopolitical analyst and commentator. Elina, good to see you.
Happy to be back.
Of course. All right, everybody, hit the like button as you come on to boost this stream on this holiday. But let us begin. So I want to actually play a variety of commentaries from Donald Trump himself. I want your assessment of the situation with Iran now in the aftermath of the so-called 12-day war, as it's being called. This is what Trump had to say at a recent rally about the attack that Iran launched on the U.S. airbase in Qatar.
And you saw that just the other day where the missiles are being shot down one after another. You know, they called me to tell me they have to take a shot at us. This was Iran, very respectful. That means they respect us. Because we dropped 14 bombs, they said, we'd like to take 14 shots at you. I said, go ahead, I understand. Can you imagine? They were nice enough. This is Iran to call me and tell me that they would like to shoot me at 14 times. So they want to shoot us. And I said, go ahead. And they shot 14 high-grade, very fast missiles. And you saw that just the other day.
Then, in the aftermath of this 12-day war, there's been very conflicting messages coming from Donald Trump. This is what he had to say at the NATO summit.
We had a tremendous victory, a tremendous hit. And because of that, I don't think they would have been down there because they knew we were coming. When they know we're coming, they're not going to be down in that, 30 stories underground. So, no, I think it was just a tremendous victory for everybody, including Iran. Look, they've got a country and they've got oil and they're very smart people and they can come back. Israel got hit very hard, especially the last couple of days. Israel was hit really hard.
So, Greg, how about we start with you on the military side of this? Iran is warning that the next attack for Israel could be catastrophic for it. Should it start this war again? Your assessment of the situation?
Well, first of all, as much as I loathe the current chief of staff, I do appreciate that he expresses political theater for what it is. Yes, we've been watching these kind of like smoke and mirrors, de-escalation, escalation games between Iran and U.S. and Israel for the past 2 years. If you recall, Israel bombed a Iranian consulate, sovereign territory, Iranian territory within Syria in Damascus, killing intelligence and diplomatic personnel there. And Iran responded in a very telegraphed strike. And also we telegraphed our entire B-2 Spirit bomber mission on hardened nuclear sites in Iran because we told the Russians there so they could get their nuclear scientists out of their plans. And of course, the Russians just signed a 20-year security agreement with Iran. So Iran was warned before our very PR stunt oriented bombing mission that involved 157 aircraft. And then, of course, Iran telegraphed their strike to Qatar. It's all about like de-escalation. But I think what we need to pay attention to now as we watch the situation evolve. The 12-day war is not a conclusion at all. Iran doesn't want a war. It wants sanctions relief. It wants a lot of stuff from the U.S. It was not prepared to fight a high-intensity conflict, just like the United States is not ready to escalate military action. But when we talk about like long-term American led regime change operations, no, we can expect another uptick in violence in the future, and another uptick in the propaganda campaign to manufacture consent for heightened U.S. military involvement. But from the military perspective, objectively, Iran is a non-starter. I was like in Afghanistan in JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, in 2011, and they were also putting plans in place to invade Iran and to conduct special operations missions in Iran. And it was a no-go then, and we have a lot less power projection now than we did 10, 15 years ago. So what we're going to have to be watching out for is a sustained propaganda campaign in tandem with regime change. And if they can't change the regime to a more Western-oriented government that would be more favorable to us, and isolate and disconnect the security relationship between Russia and China and the Indo-Pacific, they're going to go for regime collapse. And after that, they're going to go start looking at Pakistan as well. So yeah, it's the whole regional squabble, and it's not done at all.
Yeah, Mnar, how about you? What is your assessment of the situation, particularly if you could talk about, I know Minpress and you have been following the resistance quite clearly, and here Iran was attacked and it did fight back, and now we are at the point where there are more threats being made, yet the ceasefire was asked by Israel. What's your assessment of the situation?
With Greg, that this 12-day war is not necessarily over, and there hasn't really been a concrete conclusion of what we can expect next. And the reason why we're seeing kind of this unhinged behavior from Donald Trump is not because he himself is not like this smart person. I think he's very aware of the decisions that he's making. On one hand, he's being pulled from multiple directions. One of those directions is by his very strong pro-Israel base and pro-Israel advisors, who obviously we know Netanyahu is one of those people who are pushing Trump to expand the war against Iran. I'm of the opinion that Trump personally does not want the war against Iran. And that's why he did kind of create that political theater and, to attack Iran's empty nuclear facilities, to show that the United States really does not want a full-on war with Iran. It was more like just to make his pro-Israel base, his advisors that support this war, and Netanyahu, to make them happy that he's, on their side. But he's also being pulled, being influenced by his actual base and the very big influencers that have for so long supported him. They've supported the MAGA movement. And now they're coming out, to call him out and say that Trump is abandoning his base. And so that's why I feel like Trump is giving us kind of like two different realities and responses about what he really wants to do. An expanded war against Iran would not benefit anyone. Israel obviously is the one that wants this war. They've been wanting regime change in Iran. And, we have in the region many resistance groups that have pledged to join Iran in the war if the United States enters the war. And so this is something that the United States has to consider. I mean, we have the Pakistani Zainab-e-Yun group, which is a pretty large resistance groups based in Pakistan. We have the Iraqi resistance group, many of the Iraqi resistance groups, I should say. We have the Yemeni armed forces and Yemen's Ansarullah. We also have Hezbollah in Lebanon, who have vowed to enter the war if the United States expands this war against Iran. And we did see, just in this recent 12-day war, the Yemeni resistance groups and armed forces support Iran in the war by firing ballistic missiles. And so Israel right now has suffered a very, very big loss. I mean, the Israeli government did put a censor on its citizens, saying that if they posted any videos and showed any of the destruction in, Tel Aviv and all of the areas that were targeted by Iran, that they would be considered an enemy of the state. So we technically don't really know the level of destruction that took place inside of Israel, but we suspect, and we, based on our research at Mint Press, we suspect that it is around 1/3 of Tel Aviv has been destroyed. That is massive. I mean, that will cost the Israeli government, the economy, millions upon millions, if not billions of dollars to rebuild. Iran showed Israel its mighty strength using those ballistic missiles. And it showed just how weak Israel truly is with its, failed defense systems. And so I just don't think that the United States wants to enter this war. And also we have to consider that Iran's homegrown resistance, apart from its military, apart from the government itself, Iran has a 2 million citizen group of men called the Basij who are ready to take up arms from a foreign invader. This is very different from the United States, where we have very high resistance to the war. And a lot of these protests that are taking place in our country are actually coming from active service member. And if we look at the US military itself, we are pretty stretched thin right now. We have, warfare happening and bases across Africa. We're in a supposed war against Yemen. We have the Russia-Ukraine conflict happening. I mean, we have this growing tension with China. The US is just involved in too many things. And so I really do believe that the United States doesn't want a full-blown war of aggression against Iran. But we do have to consider, and I'll wrap it up here, is that while we don't want the war, right? That's what I think. I don't think the US wants a direct war. The United States has been in a shadow war against Iran. Everything that Israel has done against Iran for decades has not been able to happen without the intelligence, the weapons, and the support from the United States. Every single assassination that Israel carried out inside of Iran could not have happened without the help of the United States. All of the weapons that were smuggled into Iran were probably, US weapons that were smuggled in there to carry out car bombings and sabotage there. And we have to remember that, while I still don't believe Trump truly wants a full-on war with Iran, he did carry out the assassination of Iran's general Qasem Soleimani when he was in office before. And who did he thank? He thanked Israel's Mossad. So, it's just really a mystery of what will happen next. But I hope that it won't turn into a full-pledged on war. But I do hope that our current active duty members and our veterans and the American public continue to say no war with Iran, because really, at the end of the day, all of this is a distraction to the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, the horrific mass slaughter of Palestinians. Our people in Palestine, I'm a Palestinian American, we have lost so much, and we are just devastated by the death toll, by the starvation campaigns, by the absolute humiliation that is happening. And so Israel is just trying to save face. Netanyahu is trying to stay in office as long as he can by distracting and pulling, the United States into another conflict that nobody wants. And that's why we see a crackdown in these Western countries on dissent, including what's happening this week in the UK with this crackdown and proscription of groups like Palestine Action, and kind of telling us that people like Bob Villan with their chants, death to the IDF, which by the way is probably many people's new ringtone right now, that's what we should be afraid of, not the fact that our governments are funding Israel's genocide and arming them to commit these massacres.
Yeah, very good points. Elina, given what Mnar and Greg just said, a lot of people were believing that Iran was bluffing for so many months about Operation True Promise 3. And as Mnar just said, this whole idea of death to the IDF, it seems like Iran is almost promising that if this war continues, what do you believe them, and do you believe Iran? And what was your assessment of this entire situation and the connections that you made from it?
All right. So, my personal opinion is that I would agree with Mnar and Greg that this hasn't concluded. However, I will defer in one aspect, and that's fundamentally when you sit down to consider the economic situation of the United States and Western imperialism as a whole, of which it's drastically collapsing at a rapid rate. And when you consider the era of multipolarity is consistently growing, and the significance of China, the trade war, the tariffs that are currently occurring, and all these proxy wars are occurring that are strategically meant in order to dismantle BRICS, whether it's through Iran, whether it's through Ukraine and Russia. The entire purpose is to completely dismantle, or to a certain degree issue massive blows to BRICS, to the BRI, and to all the promising economic prosperity that comes along with that would significantly diminish imperialism worldwide. So Iran is a major hub, and I've repeated this on copious occasions for those that know me. Iran is it's the economic hub for the BRI, and in many ways of BRICS itself, even though it's just become a member of BRICS. And when you sit down and look at the BRI, it basically, most of the most significant trade routes and energy resources will pass through Iran, but it will also be a sort of a point where the East meets the West, but also connects with Africa, even when it comes to sort of the digital Silk Road, as it's known. And as we know, the AI and the future of high tech is also a fundamental piece in the road towards sort of defeating or, sustaining imperialism. And Iran is a very big player in this aspect. And why do I bring this up? If the United States or the West does not try to dismantle or issue major blows to Iran, whether it's through direct war or covert war, in order to bring about some sort of regime change that will favor the West, this will ultimately cause massive issues within the United States and within the West. Because at the end of the day, if Iran is left to be as it currently is, what's going to happen? Iran has proven itself to be a military power. It's proven itself that it's able to defend itself. For the first time in the last 40 years, I would say in the last 8 years in total, we've seen Iran economically begin to prosper and establish economic trade relations with other countries, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be other countries within BRICS. And this is fundamentally as a result of the reactionary mechanisms that have taken place as a result of sanctions and the sanctions warfare that haven't just been imposed on Iran itself now, but also 25% of the world's population. So now there's no longer any fear for the world's, for other countries around the globe, Russia, for example, being one such example, to collaborate and enter into bilateral trade agreements with Iran. So this is going to bring a lot of economic prosperity to Iran. That therefore means that Iran as an economy, as a structure, will become even more powerful than it currently is. And if these alliances begin to form, and like I said as well, BRICS, it will even encourage the creation of more bilateral trade agreements and the industrialization of the global South. This means that the West is significantly going to lose its war to sustain imperialism. That is why I do not believe they're going to allow Iran to continue to prosper. They will never remove the sanctions from Iran unless it completely subjugates itself to the West and therefore aligns itself with the West, which Iran will not ever do, and rightfully so. And therefore, they're going to continue to target Iran. Now, with regards to everything that kind of took place, there's several things that we have to consider here. So, although the United States is going to continue its direct or indirect war on Iran, it has to factor in several things. So, as I think it was recently, like last week as well, we've seen the fact that they're not even providing certain air defense systems and ammunition to Ukraine at the moment as well, fundamentally because of stockpile limitations within the United States and within NATO as a whole. And this is also why the NATO summit just this week, we saw an increase of 5% now budget, went from 2% to 5% for the vast majority of NATO states. And a lot of the bulk of that 3.5% is going to go directly into the production of ammunition and defense in order to produce air defense systems and everything that they essentially need in order to continue the war. Because as it currently stands, the West, as a result of this deindustrialization, simply cannot keep up with Russia, China, and even Iran, who are self-sufficient industrialized economies. So if they're going to be able to have a war that's going to be stretched out on 2 fronts and possibly even 3 with regards to China, they do need to ramp up their production. So that's the one other that's one issue that the United States is also having to consider with regards to pushing forward with a war with Iran. However, the other angle is that, and this is my personal opinion, is that the United States is also trying to wrap up Gaza to a certain degree, or at least what's happening in West Asia. And what do I mean by that? I mean, over the course of the last 2-3 months, we've seen reports coming out that essentially have spoken about the U.S. Joint Gulf sort of rule of the Gaza Strip. So essentially passing over the Gaza Strip, it will no longer be ruled directly by Israel, but by the United States and other Gulf states as in conjunction, something similar to what we saw in 2003 in Iraq. And, this was leaked a few months ago, but it's something that we've heard repeatedly over the course of the last 2 years. And we're sort of hearing the same sort of objectives being regurgitated at them as it currently stands today. And so what this would mean, and I think how this would play out, and this is my opinion, is that they're going to try to sort of end the war in Gaza temporarily. They're going to try to bring in the Gulf states who've already proven, in my humble opinion, their allegiance to a certain degree. Even those countries that are, are now part of BRICS have proven a degree of allegiance to a certain degree to the United States in this sort of 12-day war between Iran and Israel, and then obviously the United States at the back, from the fact that they provided, air defense, and they basically curtailed and deterred Iranian missiles into Israel. And I think it was even Mint Press today that published, I saw Mint Press publish that, even Saudi Arabia was involved in that process, although they discuss it from the perspective of we're trying to be politically neutral and sustain peace, but it's clearly a one-sided agenda here. And when you also sit down to consider the massive investments that took place the big deal of the century sort of between Trump and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchs, a lot of that had to do with AI and these sort of huge investments that are going to take place in the Gulf states. I think we can basically see that an alignment, sort of a realignment between the Gulf monarchs and the U.S. is currently happening. And as a lot of even Western liberal media has regurgitated, this is an opportune moment in order to further isolate Iran. So what I believe is going to happen is that they're going to try to consolidate power over Gaza. I think that there's going to be a gradual transition of power to the Gulf monarchs in collaboration with the U.S. and these private contractors that are actually currently in Gaza as we speak. And as that takes place, it's going to become more socially acceptable, or so they believe, as it's going to be an Arab rule over the Gaza Strip, therefore playing into the demagoguery of the region as opposed to Israel. As this basically takes place, this would actually serve the interests of the Gulf monarchs, who also want to essentially establish and have access to the ports in Gaza and to the East Mediterranean. So I'm not saying this is plausible, by the way. There's going to be a number of hurdles in this, which I can discuss afterwards, but this is kind of where the objective is. And in doing so, by establishing new trade routes as well that they plan to use through Israel, through Gaza, Saudi Arabia, IMEC being one of them, among other sort of trade routes, they're going to try to isolate, the BRI project and sort of create this kind of competitive trade route. And then in doing so, isolate Iran even further, as in from within West Asia. And when I feel that takes place and when that happens, I think at the opportune moment, they will try to target Iran again in other ways, because Iran can simply not exist in its current form and cannot be allowed to prosper because if it does, that means that Western imperialism itself and its ability to assert itself will be significantly diminished.
Well, Greg, we saw during that 12-day open hostilities, we did see Jordan. We didn't hear about Saudi Arabia, but now we know Saudi Arabia was also providing air support. But even despite all of this, all of the Gulf help that Israel and the United States received, the United States still burned through air defenses to almost a staggering degree. I believe 20+% of the THAAD interceptor systems. Talk about this. What happened there? Because it seems now the U.S. is kind of scrambling to reconfigure itself and continue on its endless wars after just a 12-day period of, while open hostilities, they were relatively light, so to speak. Your thoughts?
Right. No, this was kind of an unprecedented distance conflict, aerial distance conflict that really hasn't existed before in military history. And just for people to appreciate the integrated air defense that went into trying and failing to protect Israel from Iranian strikes was actually vast and absurdly complex. So first of all, you've got cruisers and destroyers. I forget which carrier strike group they're attached to, in the Persian Gulf, doing interceptions directly when Iran launches ballistic missiles. Then you have Saudi Arabia also giving targeting data. Also can't confirm this, but I think they're also running interceptions. They have F-35s, and of course F-35s and other fighter craft are capable of intercepting missiles generally. And then after they pass through the Gulf airspace or Iraqi airspace, then the Jordanians and the U.S. air assets in Jordan try to attempt intercepts. And then, of course, when we get into the Eastern Mediterranean basin, we also have naval assets there, cruisers, destroyers, and fighter jets out of Cyprus trying to also run interceptions as well. So this integrated air defense system, just to protect Israel, even before Israel uses like our THAAD batteries or their Tamir interceptor rockets for the Iron Dome, is completely this entire regional network that's insanely expensive and complex, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And now one of the main things to consider in this conflict was this munitions brinksmanship. Who has leveraging Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles against the Iron Dome and all of our naval and Air Force assets within the region? And guess what? Raytheon, RTX Corps, they have a massive, massive supply chain issue with rocket propellers and rocket motors for these interceptors, not just for the Tamir missile system, which is made in conjunction with Rafael Defense Industries, which is Israeli, and Raytheon, but we don't have stuff for THAAD. We are not prepared at all for a high intensity conflict that involves air defense. We're just not. 20 years of low intensity counterinsurgency operations during the ill-fated and ill-named global war on terror has absolutely wrecked the military industrial base of the United States. And we've been reading literature about this for 15 years now, because of course it's a for-profit industry. And what made money during the global war on terror? Was it factories in the United States? No, it wasn't. We outsource all of that to other places, generally in the global South. But no, it was more about these research and development contracts. The F-35 fighter project, which was dubious at best and washed trillions of dollars out of, not trillions, but billions of dollars out. And we essentially do not have the industrial base to support even defending a country with no strategic depth against what should not be a near peer competitor, which is Iran, the Iranian military. One thing I would like to bring up is Iran has no power projection globally. The United States is the empire. We have 11 carrier nuclear-based strike groups that are able to project power throughout the world. But we have to do that. Like, authority and oppression is brittle. Like, it collapses. And Iran doesn't need to be a global military power. Neither does China. Neither does any other country. So they are actually a military peer, like, within the region. And that's how they exist. They've structured their entire military long-term strategic planning to do one thing specifically and do it well. And we really don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, good points. Well, Mnar, I have this question for you. Brigadier General of the IRGC, Ali Fazli, he said that Iran only used 25% of its missile force. And I've seen even lower numbers coming out of Iran. But as you said, and as you've been reporting on Minpress News, the war is continuing by other means and in other arenas. So I know Minpress has been talking about how the Palestinian resistance, right after the 12-day war concluded with the, I guess, cessation of hostilities, there was open fighting between Israeli forces and the Palestinian resistance, and Israeli forces have taken quite a bit of damage, actually. And then we have this story that I wanted to pull up because the United States is very much still involved in the overall theater of war and genocide in West Asia. Here is the story of U.S. contractors firing live ammunition at Palestinians seeking food from the Global Humanitarian Foundation, which has been absolutely debunked in so many ways. But you can talk about that, Mnar. Now, I want your assessment of this situation, the broader war in this context.
Well, it's true that Iran used very little of their military might. And in what they used, they completely destroyed, like I said before, likely about 1/3 of Tel Aviv, while hitting many of Israel's military bases and intelligence offices like Israel's Mossad. And so it really showed just, that Iran is using very little of what they can use. I mean, I spoke with Dr. Mohammad Marandi on numerous occasions, and I interviewed him for Mint Press, and he explained it very well by saying that, Israel is really nothing to Iran. They've been preparing for a war, again, not against, but in defense of their country if the United States were ever to attack. And so they're not really worried about Israel. And what we saw in this 12-day war is that Iran just, destroyed and used very little of what they have, and they did a lot of damage for Israel. And that's why Israel is kind of back at the United States on their knees begging for more. But something that really was exposed to a lot of people in this crisis are the crocodile tears of the Middle Eastern Arab countries, especially the Gulf states, when we saw that, once again, Israel can't carry out this war against Iran without the help of not just the United States, but its new allies in the region, thanks to the Abraham Accords. When Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo were hopping around the Middle East in 2020 to build this alliance, the so-called, peace accord with Israel, it was never really about peace. It was always about building trade between Israel and its Arab and Gulf allies, and also building this military alliance in preparation for an Israeli war against Iran. And so we saw a little snippet of what that would look like. U.S. military bases in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Syria, and the UAE were helping Israel intercept Iranian missiles, and Israel was using the airspace of Saudi Arabia to target Iran. Saudi Arabia provided Israel with radar data, intelligence, surveillance, and airspace. And so Al Ubaid Air Base in Qatar, naval support activity in Bahrain, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and US forces in Jordan, Turkey, they were all encircling Iran, monitoring and neutralizing its defenses. So we don't have neutral actors in the Middle East. Thanks to the Abraham Accords, these countries are now actively complicit in Israel's war against Iran. And that was the purpose of the Abraham Accords. And when we see what happened in Gaza, Israel, again, keeps trying to show its military might against Palestinian resistance and other resistance groups in the region. But the resistance on the ground is showing that they're able to target and attack Israel in ways that they don't expect. I mean, Israel is armed to the T by the United States with some of the strongest and most advanced military. They also produce their own military equipment through their largest arms company, Elbit Systems. and they're up against these homegrown resistance groups in Gaza. And so Israel is led by Netanyahu, will not take this. They don't want to feel embarrassed on the global, in front of the global community. And so that's why they're using these aid traps, like mouse traps, to continue to humiliate the Palestinians. And it's really disturbing to see how they're doing this, because when Yoav Gallant announced the war in Gaza and said that we're dealing with human animals, he described us Palestinians as human animals, we can see that they're treating us as such. And in the way that they're setting up these aid traps by these aid organizations that are being used by Israel's Mossad and other intelligence groups to spy on Palestinians. And we have Israeli soldiers coming out saying that they were ordered to shoot at Palestinians gathering for aid, even if they don't pose any sort of threat. We have Israeli soldiers that have recently come out and have stated that they felt like the Nazis and the Palestinians were like the Jews in the way that they were treating them. And so Israel is starting to also face some resistance within its own military. It's not very much, but there are now Israeli soldiers coming out opposing the war. They're, coming out with a lot of PTSD. And we have to remember that a lot of Israel's military is made up of young, early 20s. Basically, they're like, young kids. When I went to Palestine 2 years ago, I was actually there. All of the checkpoints were led and managed by 20-something-year-olds. They were all younger than me. And Israel is showing itself to be a paper tiger. And that's why it is trying to expand its warfare on the international front with these other resistance groups like Ansar Allah and Lebanon's Hezbollah. It's because they are losing the war on the ground. Sure, they have massacred Palestinians. They're engaging in this mass starvation campaign. Palestinians have suffered a lot, but on the military front, the resistance groups on the ground in Gaza are making very big waves against the Israeli military. And the only way for Israel really to fully ethnically cleanse Gaza and to remove the people there, as they plan to do, to put the Palestinian people in, tents in the Sinai desert, is through the help of the United States with U.S. troops on the ground. We do know that some U.S. troops are on the ground, but we don't know for sure how many. I'm sure Greg probably knows more about that than I do. But that's where what we're seeing right now with Israel's force.
Well, Elina, let me ask Greg first then, because I think it's a good point. I mean, Greg, I'm sure you have some experience with U.S. contractors. I want to know your take on or your reaction to what Mnar said, but also this development where we see U.S. contractors working for Israel, essentially, around the so-called aid project, which has turned into essentially a mousetrap target zone, as Mnar put it. Hold on, Greg, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was personally never involved in the defense sector. When I got out of Ranger Regiment, which was a U.S. Special Operations unit, I was approached by Academy, which had to rebrand from Z, which had to rebrand from Blackwater for right. $300,000 a year contracts in Africa. Doing what? Well, they wouldn't tell you unless you accepted the job first. So let's actually talk. I know. Let's actually talk about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, because it's important. It kind of is illustrative of how the entire system works. It's, again, for profit. They could send U.S. troops on the ground. There's diplomatic and political reasons why you wouldn't. But again, this is about money. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, is an American organization based in Delaware, of all places, established in February of this year. So it just kind of popped up out of nowhere, just for this specific purpose, to distribute humanitarian aid. And it was formerly led and founded by Jake Wood, who was a former Marine sniper. But he actually resigned in May, like late May, because he criticized the United Nations and humanitarian groups for politicizing aid distribution. He thought that it was really sketchy, and he was open to like legal action. So he resigned, and it's now run by Johnny Moore, an American evangelical leader and businessman who founded the Kairos Company. It's a public relations firm. He's a commissioner for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's an evangelical Zionist, and he's now running the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So I actually recently went to Washington, D.C. to try to talk to some of these guys who were part of GHF. Wasn't able to speak to any of them directly. Apparently, the Associated Press got access. But I did talk to some people who applied for the position. One of the guys was a former combat veteran Marine infantryman. He applied for the Gaza Health Foundation. But they weren't accepting them. He didn't have a special operations background, even though he'd been in defense circles for a long time. And as a former member of the special operations community, I can tell you one thing: zero experience in logistical humanitarian operations. Don't even know what that looks like. So when we talk about the Gaza Health Foundation, there are other groups there. There's UG Solutions, SRS. What we're looking at is an attempt and a trial run to privatize security and aid distribution, and eventually like real estate and construction throughout the Gaza Strip. So if we look at the pattern since January in the Trump administration about how these military contractors, let's stop calling them that, let's call them mercenaries, they're mercs, they did a test run to run a couple checkpoints in the Netarim corridor. Sorry, the corridor along the Wadi Gaza that bifurcates North and South Gaza, just to see, like, would they get attacked? Would Hamas attack U.S. contractors? Well, no, they didn't, because they're not completely stupid. So then they expanded to aid distribution. And now if this works, I mean, they're catching a lot of controversy. They're going to expand it into sending U.S. military combat engineer contractors to start doing redevelopment. So this is all a test and pilot program to not only like normalize it within the public space. So we just get normalized with the idea that, yes, there are U.S. citizens on the ground doing this stuff, but they want to expand the entire program, because one of the most lucrative jobs, positions, occupations within the context of the global war on terror was military contractors. Like, I was on bases in Kandahar, Helmand, Jalalabad, all throughout Afghanistan. My buddies were. U.S. soldiers weren't actually doing compound security. That was outsourced to military contractors, because it's all about washing money out of the public taxpayer base into the private sector. So is sending U.S. military contractors the best idea? Will it work out politically, diplomatically? No, but it's a grift, and they're there to make money. So what we're looking at with the Gaza Health Foundation does have some political merit to it. We don't want to actually have U.S. soldiers on the ground. So this is a great like middle ground diplomatically, which is why you use mercenaries in the first place. Russia does it, like all the nations do it. But this is what it's about. It's about money and privatization of the entirety of the Gaza Strip. Will it work out? Definitely don't think so, but they're going to try and go forward with this come hell or high water.
Yeah, Elina, come in, your analysis.
Yeah, so actually, I was going to make a lot of the same points that Greg made. I mean, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I think it was the Gray Zone that did a fantastic investigative piece as well with regards to how it's essentially being used to launder money, not just by, the United States, but also by members of the Israeli establishment itself. And then simultaneously, I think much like Greg said as well, it's a stepping stone, and I think I've written about this before as well, to the privatization of Gaza, but it's also an experimental process into what I would say is the establishment of the Gaza 2035 plan. Because when we start looking into the Gaza 2035 plan, which was sort of laid out a year and a half ago, there was a 3-stage process that was outlined. And the first stage, as they basically called it, was essentially establishing humanitarian bubbles inside of Gaza, which we heard, I mean, this was pretty much regurgitated even during the Biden administration. So yes, this is not something particularly new. So establish humanitarian bubbles inside of Gaza that would slowly eliminate the control of Hamas over of the region of Gaza. This would be established via the assistance of private contractors, particularly U.S. private contractors, or as Greg rightfully outlined, mercenaries. And then when this would gradually, once this was to take place and they establish these humanitarian bubbles, eventually with time, and this is the idea, like within the next 5 to 10 years, although I think they're going to try to do it in a far sooner period of time due to the, like I said, the material conditions of the declining economy of the West and the innate contradictions of capitalism. They're going to try to amplify that. But within the next 5 to 10 years, stage 2 essentially states that, much like I said earlier, we're going to see an joint Arab leadership over the Gaza Strip, and eventually they're going to sort of establish within Gaza a new authoritative body that's going to be de-radicalized, as they claim, which is like a new sort of Marshall Plan that's going to be established within Gaza, that's going to be normalized within this whole framework of the Abrahamic Accords, which is fundamental to obviously not just normalizing for Israel, but also, cementing West Asia firmly into the grips of the United States. And then the third stage would, eventually be giving Palestinians some sort of rights within that sort of framework. And then, in fact, in the Gaza 2035 plan, it was outlined that they plan on doing the same thing. The objective is to achieve the same. The Gaza 2035 plan is kind of like the prototype of what they plan on doing in Yemen and in Lebanon. This is actually outlined in the Gaza 2035 plan. So, this is so what we're seeing in Gaza. What I'm seeing currently take place, especially with the new with these private contractors that we even saw, as Greg rightfully said, we saw them even during the ceasefire as well, the ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian leadership. Again, we actually saw that was the first dose of the American private mercenaries, contractors that were placed inside Gaza to essentially supposedly start bringing in aid. What they were effectively doing is trying to infiltrate into Gaza from the ceasefire, in order, because it was known that the ceasefire would eventually be broken. So they were basically setting themselves up. And this is for the purpose of basically driving out the resistance and trying to squash the resistance. Now, I don't personally think this is going to be very successful, because Gaza is a very hostile terrain, a very hostile territory, with so many young Palestinian boys consistently joining Hamas and joining the Palestinian resistance factions. I mean, understandably so. There's been an ongoing genocide, and according to recent reports published by Harvard University, 500,000 Palestinians inside of Gaza are basically possibly dead. So this is the impact that this has had on these people. Therefore, to be able to establish these sort of humanitarian bubbles and to have these private contractors inside of Gaza to establish these sort of bubbles is not really going to essentially successfully drive out the Palestinian leadership. But this is what they're going to try to do. And in my humble opinion, the objective would be to try to bring in the Arab Gulf of sort of authority within Gaza as soon as possible, because that might be, like I said before, playing to the demagoguery of the region, the only way to sort of somewhat placate the Palestinian resistance, under the belief that at some stage they're going to, maybe provide them with some protections, because these are an Arab joint leadership over the Gaza Strip. I also wanted to sort of quickly just bring up Syria into this as well, because we're also seeing the normalization now. We saw Jolani and sort of openly into dialogue with Netanyahu at this point, and speaking about the normalization between Syria and Israel, and basically they're going to become part of the Abrahamic Accords. And this just goes to show what's happening within the region, and why Iran, going back to Iran, is so significant. Because if we go back into one of the policy papers, Path to Persia, one of the main threats that the United States views with regards to Iran is that it's not just its relation to China and to the BRI, etc., but also the fact that it funds global terrorism, or it prevents the main tenets of the status quo and the normalization with Israel. The very existence of Iran does that. And if it continues to become stronger, even though Syria has now, more fallen into the realm of Western control, it hasn't been firmly controlled. I mean, it's still a hot pot of violence, sectarian violence that's taking place inside of Syria, that the West won't be able able to establish full control over. And so long as well Iran continues to exist, the resistance will continue to exist inside of Syria, inside of Lebanon, inside of Palestine, which is why I also argue that this is another reason they're going to try to target Iran, because their plan is to try to normalize within the Abrahamic Accords, isolate Iran, and get rid of the resistance. And we're seeing that take place right now with Syria. And I believe that with the, like I said, with the Gaza humanitarian
foundation,
the foundation,
the foundation, yeah, they're trying to establish the Gaza 2035 plan, which will be a failed operation, but they're going to try to do it, because if they fail to do so, and if they don't sort of secure their control over the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian resistance is very much a big part of the resistance force within West Asia. They need to placate them so that this doesn't continue. The Palestinian issue no longer is an issue. In order to establish their control over the region.
Can I just say one thing? This is all so exhausting. Because like the same people within the freaking academic and media apparatus, within the defense apparatus, that were, making the same decisions in Iraq and Afghanistan, which didn't work at all, are the same ones now crafting policy. So I know it seems kind of depressing when we talk about these things and the plans they have, but like when have they ever worked out? Didn't work out in Vietnam, didn't work out in other military interventions throughout the globe, and didn't work out during the global war on terror. And one of the things I'm like, now it's the 4th of July and we're supposed to be like saluting the flag. It's never worked. We've never won a war, and that's not the point. The point is to cause mass destruction and violence, destabilization operations to make money. And in that context, now it's the 4th of July, we always win. So these massive like plans that they've had for sitting in a desk for 20 years, 30 years, they're going to try for it, and it's not going to work. I just wanted to put that out since it's the 4th of July. And it's just exhausting seeing this stuff play out by the same decision makers all the time. That's all.
Mnar, yes, come in. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Hold on.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to that, because despite how grotesque the system appears on the outside, which it is, I think what the war in Gaza has really done is expose the moral depravity of the Western so-called democratic countries. And so we're seeing people that, on a mass scale, humanity turning against Israel right now, including right here in the United States. And we're seeing people who might have been, pro-Israel, or maybe lean towards being pro-Israel, or maybe we're just confused about the issue, or maybe tried to stay neutral for a long time. They just didn't understand. Now we're seeing so many people across all political and sectarian and religious lines uniting against Israel's genocide in Gaza. And not just that, they have broken through the fog of war and are starting to question other U.S. policies about previous wars that maybe they didn't understand, or maybe that they had, maybe had supported in the past. And so I do think that is a positive outcome that has come out of this thing. And unfortunately, that is the case for, the way psychology works, is sometimes, people have to experience and see the mass suffering to this degree for them to really wake up. And so that's why I think, like, despite how bad things are, we are seeing this wave of revolution and resistance and dissent across the world, but especially right here in America, where, Americans for a long time, I always said, are the most propagandized people on the planet. I mean, we went from having 50 corporations owning our media to only 6 corporations. And yes, we are bombarded with a lot of misinformation and fake news that is being created by, corporate media here in the United States. But people can't look away now from these images. They can't look away from the suffering of Palestinians. And because of the dissent and because of this mass wave of people banding together to speak up against this horrific war, even the New York Times has been forced to readjust their coverage. Even CNN and MSNBC and the Washington Post, truths are slipping through for people to support or to break through the fog of war.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Greg, I wanted to ask you actually in response to what Elina was saying about the Abraham Accords, right after the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities between Israel and Iran, U.S., Israel, and Iran, we saw Israel, of course, ramp up its bombing of Gaza, the whole Gaza Humanitarian Foundation debacle continuing. But we also saw Israel clamor really hard for the Abraham Shield, as they're calling it, the security initiative part of the Abraham Accords. And of course, Donald Trump is pushing for this hard, of course, with the Gulf countries attempting to get them and Syria, which has offered, I think, a third of the Golan Heights as its one concession that it wants from Israel. Your thoughts on this part of it, because it seems like that pivot was pretty meaningful. It seemed very rapid and desperate at the same time.
Well, Donald Trump, one of the big prideful moments of his first administration was the initial stage of the Abraham Accords with Bahrain, Morocco, other countries. But yes, he wants to push for Arab normalization with Israel, to secure the region in a stabilized way that's completely subservient to Western interests. One of the big problems I have with people that kind of have these kind of conversations is that Israel is running our foreign policy. No, it's all part of the same system. Israel is just an extension of the U.S. empire to conduct adventurous wars and destabilization operations to reshape the region into vassal states that will allow Western capitalists to exploit their people and resources. And that is the essential underlying marrow of these Abraham Accords. That's it. So they want it with Lebanon. They want to demilitarize Hezbollah. That's why we're building that horrific, monolithic, massive embassy in Lebanon. I don't know if you guys have seen pictures of it. It's actually just going to be like a massive intelligence hub that's going to be full of like CIA contractors. But monuments actually throughout history telegraph policy, government policy. So we're doing that in Lebanon. Of course, we're leveraging sanctions on Syria to get them to normalize. Jordan, Egypt, they're already in the bag. Gulf states, obviously, Saudi Arabia is trying to play like both sides of the fence between like the East and West battle. But no, that's the heart of it. And Israel is our anchor in the region. And so, yeah, they're going to push for pan-Arab normalization. And this would happen. It's not Trump's initiative. This would have happened under the Biden initiative. There is no kind of daylight between different presidencies in terms of this kind of foreign policy. We can even look at the Iranian strike package, which, we called Operation Midnight Hammer. That wasn't a Trump operation. That was put together and collated under the Biden administration, and joint air operations were conducted, training exercises for that operation, because again, it involved 157 aircraft to accomplish under the Biden administration. So yes, there are different domestic policies between presidents, but when it comes to this, no, this is just the U.S. interest happening. Now, Trump might have a different flavor about how he does foreign policy. But no, this has been a long-standing foreign policy push for not 10 years, 20, 30 years.
Mnar, actually, I know your time is limited, so if you have any comments that you want to put out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have to go soon, but I want to draw everybody's attention to what's happening in the UK right now with the British government's proscription of Palestine Action as a terror organization. This should concern every single person that cares about dissent and about stopping wars. I mean, I love that I'm a journalist and we have this opportunity to report on the profiteers of the war machine, to get behind the headlines and to have these conversations and to educate people. But truly, true dissent, another form of dissent that we can talk about is the actions, the direct actions of Palestine Action. in the UK. They've set an example for the entire world about what true dissent looks like in financially targeting Israel's largest arms factory, Elbit Systems, which is based in the UK. This is a group of activists that many of which I know personally, from the co-founder to many of the people that are a part of this group. And I've sat with them, I've interviewed them. I actually went to one of the towns called Oldham in the UK, visited there and interviewed residents. And what Palestine Action has done is a grassroots form of activism in bringing communities together, regular people, to protest and occupy the buildings of Elbit Systems. And Elbit Systems is Israel's largest arms factory. They are producing many of the drones and the components for drones for Israel to use to bomb and target homes and civilians and hospitals and schools in Gaza. And because of Palestine Action's direct action work, they have cost Elbit Systems, millions upon millions of dollars worth of contracts with the British government. And right now, not Palestine Action, but Elbit Systems is sitting on a contract of $760 million for building parts in the UK to have another factory open. And so what we've done is we've exposed some of the Israel lobby groups that are working in the UK to get the British government to prescribe Palestine Action as a terror organization. And one of those groups is We Believe in Israel, which is a very infamous Israel lobby group. And it's run right now by a director named Catherine Shekdam, who we actually exposed at Mint Press as being an infiltrator and spy working for the Israeli government. She actually, before she became known as an Israeli spy, she worked within independent media here in the United States, and she even contributed to outlets like Mint Press. And she was very pro-resistance, very anti-war, and she infiltrated at the deepest levels in Iran. She even met with Imam Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, before coming out as an Israeli spy. And she right now is leading the effort to prescribe Palestine Action as a terror organization. And so it's really disturbing to see once again how a foreign government, the state of Israel, an apartheid state, a colonizer, having such influence within the British political system for the UK to prescribe a direct action group like Palestine Action as a terror organization. And the UK government is going along right with it. And it just took, the UK government is happy to prescribe Palestine Action as a terror organization when all they do is occupy Israel's arms companies. They smash the windows and spray paint them to draw attention to Israel's crimes that are taking place in Gaza, while the UK is actively providing, I believe, F-35 fighter jets to the Israeli government and many other arms exports to Israel, and providing them with intelligence so that Israel can commit crimes in Gaza. So once again, the moral depravity of the so-called Western governments is being exposed. And this should concern everybody, because Palestine Action for a long time has set a moral example of the kind of direct action on the ground, grassroots, bringing communities together, regular people, to occupy and target these Israeli weapons factories. And now that could end very soon. And so when we think about, when people in Palestine are saying, help us, the groups like Palestine Action are saying, well, we're going to take matters into our own hands, because the normal routes that are given to us, like lobbying the governments or petitions or, maybe even journalism or having discussions with think tanks, all of those things, at the end of the day, that doesn't always necessarily work. It's taking direct action. And so this is why we should be very concerned about this new development in the UK.
Well, Well, Mnar, it was really great having you on the show today. Everyone should be sure to support Mint Press News. The link is in the video description after the show is over. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, take care. So if you all have about like 20 more minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. And now that my part-time employer is gone, we can really cut loose. Let's do
it. All right. Well, Elina, let's start with you. Maybe we can talk about the global significance and lessons, not only of the what's called the 12-day war, but really the situation regionally in West Asia from Gaza to Iran. What's your assessment of this?
Well, my assessment is, well, listen, it's rather complicated. So, I mean, to kind of go off of what Mnar's point was, there has been a certain degree of global kind of awakening. However, at the same time, I personally do see a significant amount of reactionism as well, and a failure to understand the bipartisan, or rather, the two-party dictatorship in the United States and the long-standing sort of policies, and not just within Western Asia, but I mean, long-standing policies within Eastern Europe, long-standing policies in South America. I mean, even if we were to talk about West Asia, for example, even if we go back all the way to the sort of Bush administration, after the Iraq War, there was in the New Yorker, I think it was, an article that was published, was discussing actually how the Bush administration was redirecting its ambitions in the Middle East towards Iran. This was as early as 2005, 2006. 2007. And as I think Greg also outlined earlier on, we know what the ambitions and what the goals were for Iran from several decades prior, from the sanctions war, but also from from the first sort of Iran war that was in many ways supported and sort of propagated by the US, and even aided, the United States had actually aided Saddam Hussein in even carrying out chemical weapons attacks against Iranians. So, I mean, I think, the entire goal in order to sustain global hegemony have been long-standing plans, whether it's in West Asia, like I said, whether it's in the African continent, whether it's in Eastern Europe. And I think although on the one hand we are seeing a particular understanding as to what is the sort of face of the Western democracies and what they really are, and rather the facade of bourgeois democracy, and the facade of the United Nations, which has sort of been the aesthetic that has been sold to the world as like sort of the moral compass of the world, is now sort of dissipating. I would kind of, sort of warn against being too overly optimistic, because we are seeing, for example, in the United States, there is a significant portion of reactionism. I mean, I've been seeing protests in the US that are kind of going against Donald Trump. However, in their protest against Donald Trump, I've seen individuals hold the NATO flag, which is, they're basically going against Donald Trump and his policies in, for example, West Asia, in Iran, etc. But at the same time, then they're holding NATO flags and symbols in order to say, we have to support, keep supporting NATO. And NATO has been the military and the military arm of imperialism that has, contributed to the destructions of, states, whether it be Libya, whether it be Yugoslavia. And even now, when we talk about what happened in Iran, for example, like Greg rightfully outlined, when you sit down to look at how many nations had to come in to sort of help defend Israel from Iranian missiles, I mean, this was a joint NATO operation with the addition of the Gulf states quite effectively.
Yeah,
that
involved 3 nuclear powers to do it, by the way. Just want to put that out there.
Exactly, 3 nuclear powers as well to do it. So, I think that we need to be very careful as to how we outline this. And then I just wanted to say something very quickly with regards to, I just want to connect this with the big, beautiful bill that Trump just passed with what's happening globally. And if there's something that we noticed, is that we're seeing in the United States under this bill, and it was happening even prior to Donald Trump anyway, was the great destruction of social welfare programs programs in the United States in order to basically militarize and continue to fund these foreign policy objectives abroad. I think something like 300 billion in total is going to be given to like the defense industry, which means all, you know, the military industrial complex that, you know, that we often refer to is going to make billions, if not more, in profits. And, you know, I think it was even Francesca Albanese from the United Nations sort of special rapporteur who even published a piece saying genocide is profitable, because it absolutely is. You know, the Palestinians, the Gazans have for a significant period of time have been used as guinea pigs for the military industrial complex in order to, you know, practice weapons in combat situations, etc. But, you know, when you look at what's happening, you know, in the NATO summit, increasing sort of production, military spending by 5%, with 3.5% being now given to produce ammunition, stockpiles, tanks, and air defense systems. We're seeing a complete, you know, destruction of social welfare in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in order to continue these operations in Ukraine, in West Asia, and probably, like I said earlier, even directly against China. Now we're seeing the same thing sort of taking place in the United States, all of which are going to significantly impact the working conditions and the working class in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, you can see this is sort of the system normally you would think that this is sort of self-sabotage, but it speaks to the fact they're in a state of desperation, because if they do not tackle BRICS, if they do not tackle Iran, if they do not try to curtail and contain, Russia, as well as Iran, and then China through the trade wars, among other projects that they have in place, the Western Empire, as it currently is, will collapse. But ironically, in their quest to continue to push for this, you know, to sustain their global hegemony, they're actually bringing about their own demise. They're actually accelerating it, because we're going to see, speaking to the sort of the reactionary forces within the United States, although yes, it's still at a primitive point, I would say, I still think there needs to be a lot of sort of understanding as to global systemic issues that are currently taking place. Because as Greg said, for example, when you look at what's happening in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians, many would just say, oh, Israel is the core problem. And if Israel is dealt with, everything would go away. That's not how it operates. The United States and its ruling class are the ones that are essentially carrying out these operations. However, as they continue to do so, we're going to see more protests in the U.S. We're going to see a greater pushback, as you know, small to medium-sized businesses are going to be effectively completely eradicated. Because I don't know if everybody's aware, but in the next 5 days, the tariffs, the pause on tariffs, is officially coming to an end. And Trump has just come out and said, you know, we're looking at 60% tariffs and 50% tariffs here and there, but he hasn't disclosed yet which countries will get the 50 and 60%, etc. But this is going to destabilize the market. So even the small little tax cuts is given to, I guess that's supposed to help the average household, will not do anything given the sort of market shock that these tariffs are going to cause to the average American. We're seeing the greatest wealth transfer to the ruling class as they're continuing to effectively push for war, because they need this war, not just in Iran, but against the whole construct of multipolarity, against BRICS. This is a war against BRICS, because if they do not bring BRICS down, like I said, their ability to exploit the world and sustain their profit margins will essentially be depleted. And I don't see the ruling class in the U.S. developing a consciousness to change their social, the way that they, socialize their economy. So, that's kind of where I would like to, finish off, I guess.
Yeah, no, and just to piggyback off that, you know, if they can't do it globally, well, you know, when we say platitudes like fascism is imperialism turned inward, well, they'll do it here, and that's kind of what we're seeing, and it's so fun to watch on the 4th of July.
Well, yeah, no, maybe final comments then on the global significance then of what we're seeing, the lessons of not only Iran, but what's happening in West Asia.
Well, this all ends with China. Even just to use a personal anecdote, when I was like 22 in Afghanistan, and just transitioning over to more intelligence role, we were talking about like actually wrapping up operations for special operations units in Afghanistan and actually trying to build air bases and bases in India, because the goal has always been to, at least within some defense spheres, and there are different coalitions and different ways of thought within, you know, the entire defense apparatus, which includes universities, think tanks, intelligence agencies, the military industrial complex, that have wanted to wrap up engagement within CENTCOM, U.S. Army Central Command, which is a combatant command that kind of spans from Egypt all the way to India, and transition all those assets into Indo-PAC-COM, Indo-Pacific Command, and focus more on isolating China. And the way the U.S. really wants to do it, it's very plain to see, even if you look at Iran, how we've militarily surrounded them with bases. Well, we do the same thing with China. You know, you got South Korea, you got Okinawa, our presence in Japan, you got Taiwan. We wanted to militarize India, didn't work out for a lot of complicated reasons. And one of our reasons we were in Afghanistan was to try to strategically isolate China as well. So this all ends like all these conversations that we're having about Iran, about Gaza, about pan-Arab normalization. The end goal is China. That's it. And it's been that way since I was a freaking kid, 18-year-old kid, just learning about the world in these defense circles. It's always been about China. We, however, are so wrapped up in stupid ideological thinking, also heavily leveraged by the basic economic system of capitalism, that we're making stupid decisions. Like, it's really not going to work out, and it's not a sustainable model. One thing I want to point out is, now that we're seeing a lot of scary stuff happen in the United States, with the opening of Alligator Alcatraz, which was built through the plundering of FEMA funds. And if you're the international audience, you don't know what FEMA is. It's the government-run disaster relief agency in the United States. It was used to build this camp, and now that the big beautiful bill has passed, ICE and Customs and Border Patrol has now become one of the most well-funded militaries on the planet. And they're not the military, they're the cops. And of course, we can go down the rabbit hole of talking about how the militarization of the police exists. But what we've seen, even this morning, I just read NORCOM talking about another combatant command, North America Command, just put out a statement saying that we're mobilizing the National Guard and the Marine Corps to provide base security to Alligator Alcatraz and logistical support from active duty Army units. We're going to see a fusing now, a conflation of military and paramilitary units that will end up in the SS 2.0. And the reason I wanted to bring this up, and why China and Iran and Gaza is all relevant for the audience, is it's all connected to the same system. And the Americans can't afford to not care about foreign policy anymore. Like, whatever violence and repression we do overseas, 100% of the time, 9 times out of 9, comes home to roost and is directly used on you. I think the precursor to the modern internet, ARPANET, the first integrated network system, was used to target Viet Cong on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and civil rights organizers, union organizers, anti-war veterans, and student bodies during the Vietnam backlash. It happens almost immediately. So now we're using Palantir AI targeting systems and targeting algorithms to devastate Gaza and kill as many people as you can, because I've dropped population heat maps and bombing heat maps, and they're the same. They're just trying to kill as many people as possible. But that is now used as predictive policing algorithms within the United States. Predictive policing algorithms exist because the cops need a force multiplier. You know, if people rise up, one thing's been true in history: there's never enough soldiers and never enough cops. So we use predictive policing algorithms that were tested in the occupied territories in Palestine to preemptively reallocate police assets to hotspots. And you know, it's a force multiplier. So all these struggles are transnational, they're connected, and you need to start caring about foreign policy. Happy 4th of July.
Elina, your final comments before we get the plugs. Yeah, I agree with everything that Greg said. Effectively, as basically the Western economies are collapsing upon themselves, I actually saw an article today that was published by Politico, and hold on, I'm just going to pull it out. The title, it's called "Russian Oil or Mass Layoffs: A German Town's Conundrum." I mean, this is the current state of Europe, for example, and as I've said before, obviously, Germany has been rapidly deindustrialized. All its potential that it had with Nord Stream 2 and the sort of the agreements and trade relations that it would have had with Russia in order to effectively, I mean, there were agreements that Germany was actually going to set operations in Russia, while Russia was going to provide Europe, and particularly Germany, with sort of cheap gas that would allow it to continue to be sort of an industrial powerhouse that Germany was. Now that's no longer the case, because I guess the ruling class in Germany, as well as in the United States, they're basically co-opted by the US, not for another reason other than the fact that they have their own capital assets and investments in the US. I think there was some statistics that I saw as to Europe, the European Union rather, has some of its political class, its ruling class, have some of the largest sort of investments in the US and US finance capital. So in order to preserve the interests of the ruling class, they've completely deindustrialized and destroyed any sort of economic prospects within the European Union. They're cutting off social welfare at dramatic rates. I think, as I said before, it was, the German foreign minister who had actually come out and said that they had cut around 30 million off of like the German welfare system in order to provide Ukraine with weapons. And this is only going to escalate. I mean, the European Union actually went into decided to actually bypass its own its own deficit quotas in order to continue and invest billions into basically the militarization of the EU, which is the largest militarization that we've seen since World War II. And as this continues to happen, we're seeing, articles like this, which are essentially speaking to the fact that the public within the imperial core, whether it's in the United States or in the EU, are feeling the wrath of it. They're becoming the middle class, if you would like to call them the middle class, is essentially being completely depleted. They're being, like I said, most industries are essentially either going bankrupt or they're moving to the United States. So the United States is absorbing the remaining of the industries within the EU. And this is effectively going to have the effect of sort of an uprising. Now, what that uprising will look like, well, as it currently looks like within the EU, for example, we are seeing the far right make significant strides. Even within the UK with the Reform Party, for example, because unfortunately people haven't educated themselves as to the systemic issues that are at play here. However, as this continues to take place, we're going to see either the rise of the far right and the more, I guess, overtly fascist nature of, I guess, capitalism, to put it in the most blunt terms. And this is, I mean, we've already started to see that even with the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, the EU came out and essentially, as well as the US or the entirety of the Western world, and completely banned Russian media outlets, for example, which is a complete violation of the supposedly democratic their democratic values. And I'm so sorry. Sorry, guys.
Oh boy.
Greg, take it for 2 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Western democratic values, what are those? Yeah. Okay.
Well,
I'm just going to riff for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's riff on democracy. I feel like we're living in a very democratic state. And actually, don't regard this flag. It's not mine. It's a terrorist flag. You should definitely keep voting. That's how you affect political change. It's only going to get better.
Jeffries, he's going to be on the ballot soon. We all support him, right?
Yeah. Gavin Newsom started a podcast where he started platforming Steve Bannon. Guys, look, there are totally two different parties, and the Democrats are going to save us.
And the policies always change. They always do.
Yeah.
For the better.
Sorry, you guys, about that. I don't know what happened.
No,
I think just a bit of a dry throat, as per usual, with my allergies. But just to wrap up before I die, effectively, so as I was trying to say, this overt fascism is pretty much the face of capitalism. And up until this point in history, because of the fact that
you had so many, they were able to exploit global inequality, even China in particular, because China is one of the poorest countries in the world that has been able to industrialize and become basically the industrial superpower of the world. They were able to exploit the mass poverty worldwide in order to maximize their profits for themselves, but also to bring a particular wealth back at home that was able to placate the masses for a specific point in time. However, that's no longer the case. And so we're going to see this ramping up of mass surveillance, cracking down on, okay, you know what? Never mind.
You
It's
know
fine.
what? Okay, Elina, I think it's very clear that Hakeem Jeffries is better than you because he yapped in the Senate for no reason for almost 9 hours. So he wins. Give $5 to the DNC to combat the Republicans.
This is why we this is this is why we can't win anything, Greg. Well, Elina, I definitely want you to finish your thoughts before we get the plugs, so we can be patient here.
Yeah. How are the allergies in Cyprus?
Yeah, sounds bad. It must be all those Israeli settlers that are running to Cyprus. They're bringing all that toxic genocidal filth with them. But continue.
Obviously, this has actually not happened to me before, so this is a strange one.
No, that's true.
Apologies.
We have an episode, Elina and I, every week on the Colonial Outcast podcast, and I've never seen this before too. So,
yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so I'll just say this. Yeah, so effectively, we're as a result of capitalism's own crises and the way that globalization has essentially allowed the global south to be able to kind of move forward towards industrializing and becoming essentially prosperous, particularly with China. And now seeing sort of this allegiance that's taking place as a result of the kind of imperialism's forceful actions, whether it's through sanctions, warfare for decades that the United States has been able to exploit with the use of its dollar hegemony, or other sort of forceful operations and militarizations that have taken place, whether it's the Iraq War, whether it's the sort of regime change in Libya, as well as Syria. We're seeing sort of the contradictions of that kind of take place now. And as that's happening, and we're seeing the rise of the global south, and we're seeing how China is essentially leading that movement against Western imperialism, the West is no longer going to be able to have the sort of exorbitant privilege it's had up until this point. And and therefore it won't be able to placate its own populations, and that's why I said it's going to engage in sort of this brutal crackdown, this fascist rule over a lot of countries within the European Union as well as the United States. And I will say this as well. The West has a history of aligning itself with dictators, monarchs. They've even established monarchies. I mean, a lot of Gulf monarchs were established by the West, by the British colonial rule. And even even in Greece during the monarchy was established by the Western colonial rule in order to prevent socialist and leftist uprisings. So therefore, capitalism and imperialism aligning itself with fascist rule and dictators in order to maintain its control and suppression of resistance forces around the world is pretty much the modus operandi. And this is how they've always historically operated. And we're seeing the same thing now take place within the imperial core, and we're going to see even more brutal crackdowns because, if anything, taking a look at some of the economic policies within the United States and in the EU, it's becoming all the more aggressive and more. It's basically now a class war against the working class in the US and in Europe, and that's going to bring about a huge sort of dissent. And that's why they will no longer be able to control their own public, but also to kind of support the foreign policy objectives that they plan abroad. However, they're going to try to do so because they have no choice. Either they accept defeat and accept the rise of BRICS, or they basically try to destroy as much of BRICS as they can, to inflict as much harm on BRICS as they can in order to try to guarantee to what extent is possible their own sort of imperial control. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and governments learn from each other. So we're here languishing in the good old US of A, on the 4th of July, our anniversary of what real freedom looks like. That the big beautiful bill, which luckily Chuck Schumer got struck from the record. We can no longer call it the big, beautiful bill. Thank God the Democratic Party is fighting for us. That was the final bow shot of class antagonism. And governments learn from each other, and everyone watches the United States. So when it comes to the European governments too, you guys can expect your own little package coming your way soon.
For sure. It's there.
Your
It's
own little militarized police force too. So we're all in this together.
Oh yeah. If you're anyone, I last time I was in Europe, I took a plane out of France at Orly, I believe the airport was. If you want to see security, definitely go there because that was some of the most militarized. It was around the Summer Olympics, but it was just incredibly fascistic, ridiculous. But yeah, we can close up here. I would say, based on everything both of you said, people should be really gearing up for dangerous gambles by the United States' imperial albatross because I 100% agree. As the crises at home and abroad continue to worsen for the U.S., it's not all powerful. It is certainly having a major existential crisis on its hands in terms of its dominance. We are going to see even more dangerous gambles. I thought that's what the Israel so-called 12-day war was. It was a very dangerous gamble. I thought it was sooner. It came sooner than I could even have imagined, and it's just really, really phase one of that conflict.
It's kind of like why I made the New Year's resolution in 2025 to stop making political predictions and just like do commentary and analysis, because I come from a place where I'm a rational actor. Like that preemptive strike was so stupid. So expect more of that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I agree. I think it's going to get much worse. Oh, no, I was just going to say, I just agree. I think things are going to be happening at an even more rapid pace than they currently are. I mean, when the attack happened against Iran, I had actually said it was going to happen on a Sunday and it happened on a Friday, because they're at that stage of desperation that whether they're able to win a war or not is somewhat irrelevant. What they try to do, and I think is what Greg said earlier, is they want to inflict as much sort of damage as possible to infrastructure and economies worldwide, particularly of the global south, in order to prevent them from being able to reach their aspirations. And we're also going to see sort of a new, well, we're not new per se interest, but we're also going to start seeing similar actions within the Sahel Alliance as well, as in against the Sahel Alliance as well, which is a very popular movement now within the entirety of Africa, which is again threatening Western interests and their imperial control of the African continent, who's also looking towards BRICS and multipolarity and obviously industrializing, because when you industrialize your own economies, you're allowing yourself to economically prosper independently from private corporations that have been able to infiltrate the African continent, for example, and be able to take advantage of their resources whilst not actually putting money back into these economies. And the only thing that the West has been able to give the vast majority of the African continent is sort of debt bondage, essentially. And so creating these new alliances with China and sort of entering into new bilateral trade agreements and even looking at alternatives to the dollar, which many nations are, or even the establishment of the new development bank, for example, that will be able to even issue loans in the currencies of the countries that are pulling out the loans, therefore minimizing the sort of harmful economic impact that it will have on their own economies, but also showing signs of moving away from the dollar. This is all threatening the United States. And so this is why it's paramount that they actively destroy the infrastructure, the alliances, and all potential in the global south to obstruct it so much as is possible, that even if they don't directly win, that they can at the very least issue enough harm that it sort of pushes back the progress made up until this point. That's why I believe in the next, by the end of this year, I think we're going to see probably even more operations that might shock people in West Asia, but everywhere.
Yeah. Well, this was a great show. Everybody, make sure you go to the video description. You can follow Greg on State of Play. You can find the links where Elina shares her work. Do you have any of you two want to plug anything else before we head out?
Actually, I would. I saw someone in the comments, because I'm watching the comments. I'm watching all of you.
Oh,
someone said
dangerous.
Someone said that didn't know Greg was an Antifa twat. Well, this is not my flag. I live in Austin. I'm in my buddy's rehearsal studio. I'm currently in Chicago. And if you live in Chicago, and I know some of you guys watching are in Chicago, and you thought you had 4th of July plans, you don't. You're going to the Beat Kitchen tonight for a Palestine punk rock benefit show. There's going to be bands. There's going to be speakers. All proceeds go to Palestine Children's Relief Fund and the legal defense of some homies that apparently were like tossing cops at the DNC protest, trying to de-arrest people. I was there. I didn't see them. Allegedly, they weren't even there at the time. So anyways, we're doing that in Chicago. All proceeds go to Palestine and legal defense funds for people trying to stop a genocide. So that's what we're doing on the 4th of July. And also, you can follow Elina also comes on to the Colonial Outcast podcast.
Sure.
So you can follow there.
Yeah, I'm going to put that link there too. Elina, anything else you want to anything else you want to share before? Yeah.
Oh no, I think I've shared enough, including almost half dying. So I think I'll just leave that for there.
All right. Well, everybody, make sure you hit the like button before you go. I'm gonna put in that Colonial Outcast link as well, so people can follow and subscribe. Be sure to hit the like button before you go, because I will continue to help boost this video in YouTube's algorithm after we are done here. You can also go to the description to not only find Greg's State of Play show as well as Alina's work, but you can also find all the places to support me, Patreon, Substack, and much more. Also, thanks to Mnar Adley, the founder of Mint Press News. You can find Mint Press News support page. Be sure you're following them, subscribing, getting your news from them, and donating if you can. But without further ado, everybody, I'll be back on the 8th to cover BRICS. We're going to have some new guests, actually. We'll have Sean Fu from Singapore. We'll also have Anastasia from Think BRICS, and maybe another guest to talk about the BRICS Summit. Without further ado, everybody, I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.